In the shadows of military bases around the world, there are warriors whose identities remain hidden, their accomplishments buried in classified files. They walk among regular soldiers, their extraordinary skills masked by ordinary uniforms. But sometimes, in a single moment, the veil is lifted. Sometimes a trained eye catches what others miss, the subtle signs that separate the elite from the ordinary. What happens when a high-ranking general suddenly recognizes markings that shouldn't exist on a soldier who's supposed to be just another face in the crowd? What secrets emerge when someone's carefully constructed cover is blown by a moment of carelessness? And how does a routine weapon cleaning session become the catalyst that changes everything? This is the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, whose quiet life as a support personnel was about to be turned upside down by 4 small marks on her wrist that told a story she thought no one would ever discover. A story that would challenge everything her commanding officers thought they knew about the unassuming woman who cleaned weapons in the armory every morning before dawn. The armory at Fort Braxton was quiet at 0500 hours, just the way Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez preferred it. She'd been arriving early for weapon maintenance for 3 years now, ever since her transfer from what her personnel file vaguely listed as classified overseas operations. The other soldiers assumed she was simply dedicated, maybe a little obsessive about her duties. They had no idea that these early morning hours were the only time she felt truly at peace. Maria moved through the rows of weapons with practiced efficiency. Her hands worked automatically, breaking down each rifle, cleaning every component with meticulous care. To anyone watching, she would appear to be just another conscientious NCO doing her job. But the way she handled each weapon told a different story. Her movements were too fluid, too precise. She stripped and reassembled weapons with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of life-or-death situations where a jammed weapon meant the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic. The morning routine was more than just duty for Maria. It was therapy, meditation, and a way to keep her skills sharp all rolled into one. Each click of metal against metal, each smooth slide of a bolt carrier, each perfectly timed movement helped quiet the memories that still haunted her dreams. Memories of firefights in places that officially didn't exist, of missions that never appeared in any reports, of teammates whose names were carved only on a black wall in Langley that most people would never see. As she worked on an M4A1, Maria allowed herself to remember Afghanistan. Not the sanitized version that appeared in press briefings, but the real Afghanistan, where she had spent 18 months with a team that didn't officially exist. They called themselves ghosts, and that's exactly what they were. Invisible operators who moved through the shadows, eliminating high-value targets and gathering intelligence that regular forces could never access. She remembered the weight of her gear during those long mountain patrols, the way the thin air made every breath a conscious effort, the constant vigilance required to stay alive in a place where danger lurked behind every rock formation. Most of all, she remembered the bond she shared with her team, 5 other operators who became more than teammates, more than friends. They became family in the truest sense of the word. The memories weren't all painful. There had been moments of incredible triumph, times when their actions had saved countless lives. She thought about the village they had protected from Taliban insurgents, about the children who had smiled and waved when they passed through on patrol. She remembered the satisfaction of completing impossible missions, the pride of serving with the absolute best the military had to offer. But with the good memories came the bad ones. The night they lost Jackson to an improvised explosive device that their intelligence had missed. The mission where Martinez took a bullet meant for her spending 6 weeks in a German hospital before he could return to duty. The operation that went sideways when their extraction was delayed by a sandstorm, forcing them to hold their position for 14 hours against overwhelming odds. Maria's hands moved faster as the memories pressed against her consciousness. She had learned to channel the emotional energy into physical activity, letting her body work while her mind processed the experiences that civilian therapists couldn't understand because they couldn't know the details. The missions were classified. The locations were classified. Sometimes it felt like her entire life was classified, locked away in files that would never see daylight. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside broke her concentration. Maria glanced at her watch. 0547 hours. Too early for the regular armory staff, too late for the night shift to still be making rounds. She listened carefully, her senses automatically heightening to full alertness. 3 years of relatively peaceful duty hadn't dulled her instincts. If anything, the quiet had made her more sensitive to anything out of the ordinary. The footsteps stopped outside the armory door. Maria continued working, but every muscle in her body was now coiled and ready. She heard the electronic lock beep, followed by the distinctive sound of the heavy door opening. Whoever was coming in had authorization, but that didn't necessarily mean they belonged here at this hour. "Don't mind me, Sergeant," came a voice from the doorway. "Just conducting an inspection." Maria looked up to see Brigadier General Michael Patterson standing in the entrance. She had seen him around the base, of course, but had never interacted with him directly. Patterson was old-school military, a career soldier who had earned his stars through combat leadership rather than political maneuvering. He had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other theaters that weren't publicly acknowledged. "Good morning, General," Maria said, coming to attention.
"As you were," Patterson replied, waving her back to work.
"Continue what you're doing. I'm just observing." Maria returned to her task, but she could feel the general's eyes on her as she worked. There was something different about the way he was watching, not the casual observation of a senior officer checking on his troops, but the focused attention of someone analyzing what they were seeing. She tried to ignore it and focus on her work, but his presence had disrupted her usual rhythm. Patterson walked slowly through the armory, examining the weapon storage systems, checking security protocols, making notes on a small pad he carried. But Maria noticed that his attention kept returning to her. He watched the way she handled the weapons, the efficiency of her movements, the professional competence that marked her every action. 20 minutes later, as Maria was finishing her routine, Patterson approached her workstation. She was reassembling the last rifle, her movements quick and sure despite his scrutiny. "That's impressive work, Sergeant," he said. "How long have you been maintaining weapons?" 8 years, sir," Maria replied, not looking up from her task. "Been doing it since I enlisted." 8 years, Patterson repeated thoughtfully. "And where did you serve before Fort Braxton?"
The question was casual, but Maria heard the undertone. "Various assignments, sir?"
"Mostly overseas." "I see." Patterson was quiet for a moment, studying her personnel file on his tablet. "Says here you were with the 525th Military Intelligence Battalion. Support operations." "Yes, sir." Maria finished reassembling the rifle and began cleaning her work area. She could feel Patterson's continued scrutiny, and something about it was making her increasingly uncomfortable. Not because she had anything to hide. Her cover story was solid, her documentation complete, but because there was something in his manner that suggested he was seeing more than she wanted him to see. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Patterson said suddenly, "may I see your hands?" The request caught Maria completely off guard. "Sir, your hands?" "Hold them out, palms down." Maria hesitated for just a fraction of a second before complying. She extended her hands, palms down, trying to keep them steady despite the sudden racing of her heart. She had no idea what Patterson was looking for, but his request felt far from routine. Patterson studied her hands carefully, his eyes moving from her fingers to her wrists. Maria had always been careful about her appearance, keeping her nails short and practical, avoiding jewelry or anything that might draw attention. But as Patterson's gaze lingered on her left wrist, she realized with growing horror what he might be seeing. The marks were small, barely visible unless someone knew what to look for. 4 tiny scars arranged in a specific pattern, each no larger than a pinprick. They had faded over the years until they were almost invisible against her skin, and she had long since stopped thinking about them. But now, under Patterson's intense scrutiny, they might as well have been neon signs announcing her true identity. Patterson's expression didn't change, but Maria caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated recognition. When he looked up at her face, she saw understanding in his gaze, and she knew her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Patterson said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I think we need to have a conversation. My office. 15 minutes. It wasn't a request." Maria nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities, contingencies, explanations. But deep down, she knew that the quiet life she had built for herself at Fort Braxton was about to come to an end. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind had just reached out and tapped her on the shoulder. As Patterson left the armory, Maria stood alone among the weapons she had just finished cleaning. For 3 years, this room had been her sanctuary, a place where she could find peace and purpose without the weight of classified missions and buried secrets. Now it felt like a tomb, the walls closing in as she contemplated what would happen next. She thought about the 4 marks on her wrist, each one representing a successful completion of the most difficult training program in the United States military. The SEAL qualification training had nearly killed her, pushing her beyond limits she didn't know she had. The marks weren't official, they weren't supposed to exist at all. They were something the instructors did for the truly exceptional candidates, the ones who didn't just complete the program but excelled beyond all expectations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived 18 months in Afghanistan, countless classified operations, and 3 years of maintaining her cover, only to be undone by 4 tiny scars she had forgotten were there. As she locked up the armory and prepared to face whatever was waiting in Patterson's office, Maria Rodriguez knew that her quiet morning routine was about to be replaced by something far more complicated and dangerous. The question now wasn't whether her cover was blown. Patterson's reaction had made that clear. The question was what he planned to do about it, and whether the life she had carefully constructed was about to disappear entirely. As she walked across the base toward the command building, Maria felt the familiar weight of uncertainty that had once been her constant companion in the field. After 3 years of relative peace, she was about to discover that some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. Maria's walk to the command building felt like a death march. Every step echoed in her ears as she tried to prepare for what was about to happen. The early morning base was mostly quiet, with only a few soldiers beginning their PT routines in the distance. Under normal circumstances, she would have found the peaceful atmosphere calming. Today, it only amplified the tension building in her chest. The command building was a stark, imposing structure that housed the base's senior leadership. Maria had been inside exactly twice during her 3 years at Fort Braxton, once during her initial processing and once for a routine security briefing. Walking through those doors now felt like crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The duty officer at the front desk looked up as she entered. "Sergeant Rodriguez, General Patterson is expecting you. 3rd floor, end of the hall." Maria nodded and made her way to the elevator. As the doors closed and the car began its ascent, she caught her reflection in the polished metal. She looked composed, professional, every inch the dedicated NCO she had portrayed herself to be. But behind her eyes, she could see the wariness that had kept her alive through dozens of classified operations. Patterson's office was larger than she had expected, with windows overlooking the parade ground, where formations of soldiers conducted their morning exercises. The general was sitting behind his desk, reviewing what appeared to be several thick files. When she knocked on the doorframe, he looked up and gestured for her to enter. "Close the door behind you, Sergeant," he said without preamble, "and have a seat." Maria complied, settling into the chair across from his desk. The silence stretched between them for several long moments as Patterson continued reading. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Rodriguez," he began, reading from one of the files. "Age 29. Enlisted 8 years ago. Currently assigned to the 525th Military Intelligence Battalion, working in weapons maintenance and logistics support. Exemplary service record. No disciplinary actions. Consistently high performance evaluations." He paused, flipping to another page. Born in San Antonio, Texas. Parents emigrated from Mexico in 1982. Father worked construction, mother was a nurse's aide. 2 younger brothers, both civilians. Graduated high school with honors, turned down a college scholarship to enlist in the Army.
Maria listened without comment.
Everything he was reading was accurate as far as it went. It was the official version of her life, carefully constructed and thoroughly documented. But she could tell from his tone that this wasn't the conversation he really wanted to have. Patterson closed the first file and opened another, much thicker one. This file was marked with classification stamps that Maria recognized, and her heart began to beat faster. "Now let's talk about the interesting parts," Patterson said. "The parts that don't appear in your official personnel record. The parts that are buried so deep in classified archives that most people with general stars have never seen them." He pulled out a photograph and placed it on the desk where she could see it. It was a group photo taken in Afghanistan showing 6 soldiers in desert camouflage. Their faces were partially obscured by tactical gear, but Maria recognized herself immediately. She was kneeling in the front row, rifle across her knees, looking directly at the camera with the confidence that came from surviving impossible odds. "Operation Desert Shadow," Patterson said quietly. 18 months of deep cover operations in Afghanistan. Target elimination, intelligence gathering, and what the files diplomatically refer to as special activities. Your team had a 100% mission success rate, 0 casualties until the final month of deployment. Maria stared at the photograph, memories flooding back with painful clarity. She could almost smell the dust and cordite, feel the weight of her gear, hear the voices of teammates she would never see again. Jackson, Martinez, Thompson, Williams, and Carson. Patterson continued, pointing to each figure in the photograph. "Your team. Martinez retired after his injury and now teaches high school in Colorado. Thompson transferred to military intelligence and works at the Pentagon. Williams left the service and became a private contractor. Carson," he paused. Carson didn't make it home from the next deployment. The news about Carson hit Maria like a physical blow. She had wondered about her former teammates over the years but had been forbidden from making contact. Learning that Carson was gone felt like losing a piece of herself. "Jackson died on your watch," Patterson continued, his voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. "IAD on Highway 1, 3 weeks before your scheduled extraction. According to the after-action report, you carried his body 2 miles through hostile territory to reach the extraction point, under enemy fire the entire way." Maria's throat tightened. She hadn't talked about Jackson's death with anyone, not even the mandatory counseling sessions after her return. Some experiences were too raw, too personal to share with strangers who would never understand the weight of losing someone who had become family. "The interesting thing," Patterson continued, "is what happened after you returned from Afghanistan. Most operators in your position would have been promoted, given new assignments commensurate with their skills and experience. Instead, you requested a transfer to a standard military intelligence unit and took a significant step down in responsibility. Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Maria had known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. She considered her options: denial, misdirection, sticking to her cover story, but something in Patterson's manner suggested that he already knew more than he was letting on. "I needed a break," she said finally. The operational tempo was intense. Patterson nodded as if he had expected that answer. Combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, all perfectly understandable reactions to what you experienced. But that's not the whole story, is it? He opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be psychological evaluations and medical reports. Maria felt a chill as she realized how thoroughly her life had been documented and analyzed. "According to your post-deployment evaluation, you were experiencing what the psychologists called moral injury," Patterson said. "The report indicates that you were struggling with the nature of your missions, questioning whether the ends justified the means. Is that accurate?" Maria closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the sessions with Dr. Hawthorne, the psychiatrist who had tried to help her process what she had experienced. She had tried to explain the weight of taking lives, even when those lives belonged to people who were undeniably evil. She had tried to describe the burden of operating in moral grey areas where right and wrong weren't always clear. "Some of the targets were," she began, then stopped. Even now, even with her cover blown, she couldn't bring herself to violate operational security. "Complicated," Patterson finished for her. "Yes, I've read the mission briefs. Some of your targets were providing intelligence to coalition forces while also funding insurgent activities. Some were protecting their families by cooperating with the Taliban while secretly helping NATO forces. The moral complexity of those situations would challenge anyone." He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "But that still doesn't explain why you chose to essentially disappear, why you requested assignment to a position that barely utilized your skills, why you've spent 3 years cleaning weapons when you could have been leading special operations teams."
The truth was more complicated than Maria could easily explain.
Yes, she had been struggling with the moral ambiguity of her missions. Yes, she had been dealing with guilt over Jackson's death and the other casualties her team had suffered. But the deeper reason was something she had never admitted to anyone, not even Dr. Hawthorne. "I was tired of being invisible," she said quietly. "For 18 months, I didn't exist. No contact with family, no acknowledgement of what we were doing, no recognition for what we accomplished. We saved lives, prevented attacks, gathered intelligence that helped win the war. But officially, none of it happened. We were ghosts, and after a while, I started to feel like one." Patterson nodded slowly. The psychological impact of deep cover operations, the sense of disconnection from normal life, from your own identity. It's more common than you might think. He pulled out another document, this one, bearing the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency. "What you might not know is that your team's work in Afghanistan prevented at least 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil. The intelligence you gathered led to the disruption of several insurgent networks and saved hundreds of coalition lives. Your contributions were significant, even if they can't be publicly acknowledged." Maria felt a complex mix of pride and pain at his words. The knowledge that their sacrifices had meaning helped, but it didn't erase the cost of the work they had done. "The question now," Patterson continued, "is what we do going forward. Your current assignment is clearly beneath your capabilities. The Army has invested significant resources in your training, and frankly, we need people with your skills. The world hasn't gotten any safer in the 3 years you've been cleaning weapons." Maria looked up at him, trying to read his intentions. What exactly are you suggesting, sir? Patterson smiled for the first time since she had entered his office. I'm suggesting that it's time for you to stop hiding, Sergeant Rodriguez. There are missions that require your particular skill set, operations where your experience and training could make the difference between success and failure. The question is whether you're ready to step back into that world. The offer hung between them like a challenge. Maria thought about her quiet morning routine, her peaceful existence maintaining weapons and avoiding the spotlight. She thought about the nightmares that still woke her up some nights, the hypervigilance that made crowded places uncomfortable, the weight of memories she could never share. But she also thought about Carson, about Jackson, about the teammates who had died believing their work mattered. She thought about the attacks they had prevented, the lives they had saved, the difference they had made in places where few people could operate effectively. What kind of missions? She asked. Patterson's smile widened. The kind that don't officially exist. The kind that require operators who can think independently, adapt to impossible situations, and get results when failure isn't an option. The kind of missions you were born to handle. As Maria sat in Patterson's office, staring at the photographs and files that documented her hidden past, she realized that her 3-year attempt to disappear had been nothing more than a temporary reprieve. The skills that had made her invaluable in Afghanistan were still needed, perhaps more than ever. The world was full of threats that required invisible warriors to confront them. The question wasn't whether she could return to that life. She knew her abilities were intact, her training permanent. The question was whether she wanted to, whether she was ready to leave behind the simple piece of her morning routine for the complex moral landscape of classified operations. Looking at Patterson's expectant face, Maria Rodriguez began to consider the possibility that her story was far from over.
The 4 marks on her wrist had given away her secret, but they might also have given her back her purpose.
The general was offering her a chance to step out of the shadows and back into the fight, to use her skills for causes that mattered, even if the world would never know her name. The decision would change everything, and Maria knew that once she made it, there would be no going back to the quiet sanctuary of the armory. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt the stirring of something she had thought was lost forever. The sense that she might have a role to play in making the world a safer place. One classified mission at a time. Maria stared at the classified documents spread across Patterson's desk, her mind racing through the implications of what he was offering. The morning that had started with her routine weapon maintenance had transformed into a crossroads that would determine the direction of her entire future. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the equipment she used to carry during long-range patrols in Afghanistan. I need to know more, she said finally. If I'm going to consider this, I need to understand exactly what you're asking me to do. Patterson nodded approvingly. Smart. Never accept a mission without understanding the parameters. He pulled out a tablet and entered a series of security codes. What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels. The very existence of this program is known to fewer than 50 people in the entire Department of Defense. The screen displayed what appeared to be an organizational chart for a unit Maria had never heard of. Joint Task Force Phantom. The structure was unlike anything she had seen before, with operators drawn from all branches of the military as well as civilian intelligence agencies. Joint Task Force Phantom was created 2 years ago in response to emerging threats that don't fit neatly into traditional military or intelligence categories. Patterson explained. Cyberterrorism, bioweapons development, international criminal organizations, with military capabilities. Threats that require a response that's part special operations, part intelligence gathering, and part law enforcement. Maria studied the organizational chart, noting the emphasis on small teams with diverse skill sets. It reminded her of her Afghanistan unit, but with a broader scope and more complex mission parameters. The operators work in teams of 4 to 6, Patterson continued. Each team includes specialists in different areas: cyber warfare, chemical/biological weapons, linguistics, advanced combat techniques. They operate with minimal oversight, often in situations where traditional military rules of engagement don't apply.
Meaning? Maria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer.
Meaning they operate in the gray areas between war and peace, between military action and law enforcement, between what's legal and what's necessary to protect American interests. Patterson's expression was serious. It's not work for everyone. It requires people who can make difficult decisions under extreme pressure, who can operate effectively without clear guidance from above. Maria thought about her time in Afghanistan, about the missions where the rulebook had been more of a suggestion than a mandate. She had learned to navigate those grey areas, to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain moral calculus. It was exactly the kind of work that had eventually burned her out, but it was also the kind of work she had excelled at. "Where would I fit in?" she asked. Patterson pulled up another screen showing team compositions and mission profiles. "We have a team that's been operating one person short for the past 6 months. Team leader is a former Delta Force operator named Marcus Chen. Excellent tactical mind, but he needs someone with your particular combination of skills, advanced marksmanship, language capabilities, and experience operating in hostile environments with minimal support." He scrolled through mission briefs that made Maria's pulse quicken. Operations in Eastern Europe tracking weapons smugglers. Intelligence gathering in Southeast Asia regarding bioweapons research. Counter-terrorism work in Africa where regular military units couldn't operate effectively. "These missions," she said, reading over the summaries, "they're exactly the kind of work that made me request a transfer in the first place. High stakes, moral ambiguity, no official recognition. Why do you think I'd be willing to go back to that?" Patterson leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because in the 3 years since you've been out of the game, the threats have gotten worse. The people you used to hunt have gotten smarter, better equipped, more dangerous. And frankly, we're running out of operators who have the skills and experience to handle these situations effectively." He pulled up an intelligence briefing that made Maria's blood run cold. It detailed a terrorist organization that had acquired military-grade weapons and was planning attacks on American civilian targets. The group had connections to some of the same networks she had disrupted in Afghanistan, and their operational sophistication was far beyond anything she had encountered during her deployment. "This organization has been responsible for at least 12 attacks in the past 18 months, Patterson said. "They're well-funded, highly trained, and they're specifically targeting American interests both overseas and domestically. Traditional law enforcement is out of their depth, and regular military units can't operate in the environments where these people hide." Maria studied the briefing materials, her analytical mind automatically processing threat assessments and tactical considerations. Despite her reservations about returning to operational status, she couldn't deny that the work was necessary. People with her skills were needed to confront threats that were beyond the capabilities of conventional forces. "What happened to the operator this team lost?" she asked. Patterson's expression darkened. "Alexandra Morrison. Former Navy SEAL, similar background to yours. She was killed 6 months ago during an operation in Syria. The team was tracking a weapon smuggling network when they walked into an ambush. Morrison stayed behind to cover their extraction. She saved her teammates but didn't make it out herself." The news hit Maria harder than she expected. Morrison's sacrifice reminded her of Jackson, of Carson, of all the operators who had paid the ultimate price for missions that would never be publicly acknowledged. The cycle of loss and sacrifice that had driven her away from operational duty was still continuing. "Her death wasn't in vain," Patterson said, seeming to read her thoughts. "The intelligence her team gathered prevented those weapons from reaching their intended destination. But her team has been operating short-handed ever since, and they need someone with comparable skills to fill the gap." Maria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of expectation and responsibility settling on her shoulders. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons to decline: the danger, the moral complexity, the psychological cost of returning to a world where life and death decisions were made in split seconds. But another part of her, the part that had volunteered for the most dangerous missions in Afghanistan, was already calculating tactical approaches and mission parameters. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "what guarantees do I have? What support structure exists for operators who need help processing what they experience?" Patterson smiled, and Maria realized that her question had revealed her growing interest in the position. "Extensive psychological support both during and after missions, regular rotation schedules to prevent burnout. And most importantly, recognition that the work you'll be doing matters, even if it can't be publicly acknowledged."
He pulled out one final document, a psychological evaluation that surprised Maria with its thoroughness and insight.
Dr. Sarah Chen, Marcus's sister, as it happens, is the unit psychologist. She specializes in helping operators deal with the unique stresses of classified work. Unlike your previous experience, you won't be operating in a vacuum. There's a support system in place. Maria thought about her morning routine, the peaceful simplicity of maintaining weapons in the quiet armory. In a few hours, she could return to that routine, continue her quiet existence on the margins of military life. She could keep her secrets buried, avoid the risks and moral complexity of operational work, and maintain the emotional equilibrium she had worked so hard to achieve. But she also thought about Morrison, about the mission that had cost her life, about the weapons that were even now being moved by criminal organizations to targets that might include American civilians. She thought about the skills she possessed, skills that had been paid for with government resources, and the blood of instructors who had pushed her beyond her limits to create a warrior capable of operating where others couldn't survive. "When would I start?" she asked. Patterson's smile widened into a grin. "Team Phantom 7 is scheduled to deploy in 2 weeks. That gives us time to process your transfer, brief you on current operations, and integrate you with your new teammates. Are you saying yes?" Maria looked around Patterson's office one more time, taking in the view of the parade ground, where normal soldiers conducted normal training for normal military operations. In 2 weeks, she could be back in the world of classified missions and invisible wars, using skills she had spent 3 years trying to forget. But she thought about Jackson's final moments, about the weight she had carried when she brought his body home. She thought about Carson, who had died on a subsequent mission she might have been on, if she hadn't requested transfer. She thought about Morrison, who had died covering her teammates' extraction from a mission that sounded disturbingly familiar. "There's one condition," Maria said. "I want to visit Morrison's family before I deploy. I want to understand what I'm stepping into, what the real cost might be." Patterson nodded immediately. "Already arranged. Morrison's parents live in Virginia. They're expecting you this weekend." The readiness of his answer told Maria that Patterson had been confident she would accept. The realization should have annoyed her, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. After 3 years of feeling invisible and underutilized, it was refreshing to work with someone who understood her capabilities and expected her to live up to them. "Then yes," she said, "I'll do it." The words felt strange leaving her lips, but also inevitable. Despite her attempts to build a different life, she was still the woman who had survived 18 months in Afghanistan, who had carried Jackson's body through hostile territory, who had earned the 4 small marks that had given away her identity that morning. Patterson stood and extended his hand. "Welcome back to the fight, Sergeant Rodriguez. Or should I say, welcome to Joint Task Force Phantom." As Maria shook his hand, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Anticipation, apprehension, and something that might have been relief. The quiet sanctuary of the armory had served its purpose, giving her time to heal and process her experiences. But she was ready to be more than a weapons maintenance specialist. She was ready to use her skills for something that mattered, even if the world would never know her name. Walking out of Patterson's office 2 hours later with new orders and classified briefing materials, Maria reflected on how much had changed since her early morning routine. The 4 small scars on her wrist were no longer a secret to be hidden, but badges of honor that had opened the door to a new chapter of her service. She thought about her teammates in Afghanistan, about the missions they had completed and the lives they had saved. She thought about Morrison and Carson and all the other operators who had paid the ultimate price for work that would never appear in history books. And she thought about the threats that were even now being planned by people who believed American forces couldn't reach them in their hidden sanctuaries. As she prepared to leave behind her quiet life at Fort Braxton, Maria Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of purpose settling on her shoulders. The fight was far from over, and apparently, neither was she. The general had noticed her seal marks and stopped cold, but instead of ending her story, his discovery had given her the chance to write new chapters. Chapters that would matter, even if they remained forever classified.